Hey guys, this is Shelby with the Rogers Public Library. So this week for Full Steam Ahead, I wanted to talk to you guys about seasons, right? So we think the seasons are it's spring, summer, fall, and winter, and then spring again, right? It loops back in around itself. And last week we talked about how the weather was caused by the rotation of the Earth and the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and how that right, and how that creates or heats the Earth unevenly, and all that junk. But that's basically the same thing that happens with seasons, right? So we have the Earth, right, and this big blue line. This is the equator, and it divides the southern and northern hemispheres. And it's what in the Earth, when it rotates around the equator. But the that's not how it orbits, right? So when it orbits around the sun, it's actually tilted just a teeny tiny bit, about 24 degrees. And so for part of the year, instead of hitting the sunlight straight on right at the equator, for part of the year, the northern hemisphere gets more sunlight, and then for the other part of the year, the southern hemisphere gets more sunlight. And right, so when the northern hemisphere gets very little sunlight, we say that that's winter for us. In summer for the southern hemisphere, and then vice versa, right? So when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's winter in the southern hemisphere. And right, and so I have some pictures here, right? These are the solstices and the equinoxes, right? So the solstices, they're reversed for the two hemispheres. So in June, the summer solstice for us, the northern hemisphere gets the most sunlight, and the North Pole, right, on the furthest point from the equator, gets 24 hours of sunlight, right? It's midnight sun is what it's called, and then it's the reverse for the southern hemisphere. It gets the most sunlight on December 21st, or in this case, the 22nd. I say December 21st because that's like the calendar solstice. It's the start of winter officially. But the astronomical solstice can sometimes vary a day or two, which is the case with these pictures here that I got from NASA. But when the southern or the South Pole gets midnight sun in December, the we have polar winter on the North Pole. Right, there's no sunlight at all. It's 24 hours of dark, and so the the um the effects of this variation, right? The effects of the orbital tilt are increased as you get further away from the equator, right? So that means that, right? So if you live like up here in like, I don't know, Canada, you're going to have more pronounced winters because you're going to get less sunlight, and that makes a big difference, right? Just the more sunlight you have, the warmer it's going to be, basically, right? But the other part of this is that there's a large part of the globe that doesn't really have the same four seasons that we get, right? So we live way up in Arkansas, and we're in a temperate climate, and we experience four distinct seasons. But if you live kind of in this middle part of the globe, in the tropical zone around the equator, you're not really gonna the amount of sunlight that you get in each month of the year is going to be about the same, right? We can kind of see this on here. Where you can talk, or it's very bright up here in June, and it's very dark in December. But this area right here, this is Brazil. That's about where the equator is. It gets about the same amount of sunlight every part of the year. So instead of talking about four seasons, you talk about two seasons. Generally speaking, the wet season and the dry season, or the rainy season and the dry season. And and then that's also true for the North and South Poles, right? You don't really get these four distinct seasons. You just get a really long day and a really long night, and then a couple periods of twilight in between them, and that's the whole year. And that's actually true on some other planets too, like Uranus. When it orbits around the sun, it orbits around the sun like this, so that one pole is in sunlight for half of the year, and the other pole is in sunlight for the other half of the year, which is kind of crazy. And if the Earth orbited like this, our seasons would be way, way different. And if it orbited straight up and down like this, where we didn't have any orbital eccentricity, we wouldn't have seasons at all. It'd just be the same for the entire year. Right? So the other thing about the four seasons, right, is that it is one way of talking about the seasons in the temperate zone where we live, but it's not the only, right? So if you're an ecologist, it might be more useful to talk about the way that the seasons are expressed in the environment, right? How things change, and these are in the study of these changing signs of the seasons is called phenology, and you can call them phenological signs, right? Um, and so if we do this, we're going to start, right? If we wanted to go through the ecological seasons, just as they go through the year, and there's 6 of them, we start with hibernal, right? And this kind of corresponds with winter, right? It's decaying leaves and hibernating animals, right? So everybody's asleep, everything, nothing is really growing. And then you get into prevernal. So this is kind of like the transition between winter and spring, right? When things start warming up, but there's still nothing growing, there's no plants blooming or anything. And then you get into spring, which is where trees and flowers bloom. This is the season, and the name for it here is vernal, right? And that's kind of the season that we're in right now. Most trees are green at this point, but not all of them. We still have some things blooming. And then after vernal, you get estival, which is basically summer, where everything is green. There's not a lot of stuff blooming anymore, and baby birds start hatching. And then serodinal, you can think of this as like late summer, early fall. But this is when the leaves start changing to orange and yellow and stuff, but before they actually fall down. And it's also when crops are harvested, generally speaking. And then you get autumn, right? And that's when the leaves actually fall before they start decaying, and when birds fly south to more tropical climates. Yeah, and then you loop back around to hibernal, and those are that's a more ecologically, I don't want to say correct, but that's a different way of talking about the seasons. That has more to do with environmental changes than has to do with calendar dates, the way that we do when we talk about solstices and equinoxes. But for our experiment this week, I wanted to kind of look at the effects that seasonal changes have on plants. And the 2 main ways that plants know how to start growing in the spring is, one is temperature changes, right? It starts warming up. Another one is actually daylight hours, right? Is how much daylight the plants are getting, and whether the amount of daylight is increasing or decreasing will tell them if they're supposed to start growing again. So these systems that plants use to know when to start growing again aren't perfect, right? So sometimes if it gets warm unseasonably early, then a plant might start growing, and when it gets cold again, it can get damaged because the structures, flowers, and leaves and stuff are really, really delicate. Another thing that can happen is there's a late frost, like we had last week. If you planted a bunch of stuff last week and they got hit by the frost, then they may not have made it, right? And so for the experiment, I wanted to get some plants and expose them to cold. And so these are, I thought they were the same flower or the same plant at first, but I'm not really sure. This one is purple dead nettle. And I think this one was common henbit. They're really closely related and they look really similar, but there are a couple of differences. But basically what I did is I found these in the parking lot outside the library, and I planted them in these pots, and I let them grow for a little bit outside, just so I can make sure they were doing okay and they weren't going to die in their pots. And then I did something mean, which is I exposed this guy to cold. And the way that I did that, I tried to use compressed air. If I did this again, I wouldn't do that, because for one thing is compressed air is kind of flammable and a little bit dangerous to use. Another thing is that I managed to get a lot of dirt all over the place. So instead, I would try to learn from my mistakes and just put this one in the freezer for a little bit, so it would experience kind of virtual frostbite. And then I put these guys back outside for a couple days. And this one, it's not doing great, but it's still alive, right? You can still see the leaves are relatively green, and they're not, and a couple of them are curled up like they're drying out, but then this guy is just droopy and sad. So that's basically what happens when plants are exposed to this a late frost like that. So it's a pretty easy experiment to do, and really you can do it with just stuff you find in your yard, right? Plants and dirt. And if you don't have pots like this, you can even use like a disposable cup or something. Um, and for our craft this week, um, I wanted to do something involving flowers for spring. So I made a couple of different stamps, right? On this one, I got a toilet paper roll, and I just cut it with a little pair of scissors to make it kind of like flower pattern. And I stamped it on here. This one's green because I got some plants. I got chlorophyll from plants and I put it on the page. This one you can kind of see the stamp a little bit better. It's a little bit clearer on here. And then this one was, this one was kind of just, I was working things out. I also made this one using a pool noodle. So I think it's a little bit harder to make, but I also think it's going to be reusable. Whereas this one, well, we're going to see if we can reuse it or not. We got paper. I'm going to put paint on a paper plate, right? Just because if you put it in an easel or something, you're not gonna be able to put the whole stamp in there, right? So got it on here. This is how I did it before. I kind of twisted it around. Well, so it doesn't look like this one really turned out very well. Or it looks like it's really a single-use thing, right? Once you do this once, it's just not going to really work the same way afterwards. But that's okay. And let's try out this noodle. Oh, I like those a lot. So it looks a little bit like a flower. It's maybe not as symmetrical as we expect flowers to be, but it is pretty nice. It's pretty clear. And I just did that. I used a knife. Let's see. I want to see if we can get one with scissors because I think that'll be a little bit safer. Oh yeah, this is really easy. So I'm poking into the foam with the scissors and it goes right in, even though they're not really pointing, right? It goes right in and I just snip down. And if we not right. So now right, I just kind of got rid of every other piece. This one isn't really super flowery either, but it is nice. I mean, it's pretty easy to make. I mean, you guys just saw me make it right now in about 30 seconds. Yeah. So that's our craft for this week. I hope you guys had fun and you learned something, and I'll see you next Thursday.